Anybody heard of Calusa Waterkeeper? We are your local, yeah, that's for Jessica. We are your local waterkeeper. The Waterkeeper organization is on 6 continents, 300 chapters around the world, and basically it's the largest clean water nonprofit organization in the world. So we are the chapter based in Lee County, and our jurisdiction covers 1,000 square miles. We cover the entire Lake Okeechobee, the Caloosahatchee River, and the estuaries stretching from Charlotte Harbor down to Bonita Bay. So we have an enormous work project area that we patrol and we monitor, and we try to get out the information about what is going on with our water. Because our water is not in good shape, folks. I don't know if you've noticed that, but our water is not in good shape. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take a concerted effort by all of us to start to turn this around and clean up our waterways, which are so important to the enjoyment of our environment, but also to our economy and to our public health. We're really worried about what is going on with our public health. We've done a deep dive into public health this last year. We did 2 town halls on public health last August. And then since August, we've learned so much about what's happening with the cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, and red tide. We've become, in spite of ourselves, or we've sort of been forced to become experts on cyanobacteria, what they call blue-green algae, and Carenia brevis, which is the red tide. Red tide is a saltwater phenomenon. It's out there in the Gulf. And blue-green algae is a freshwater bacteria on our freshwater waterways, primarily the Caloosahatchee River and the canals in Cape Coral, right here where you folks are. You guys got hammered last year. So we are trying to sort this out. We spend our days and nights educating people, testing the water, and informing people about what we can do to start correcting these ills. So we do that through grassroots education, advocacy, and testing of the water. We have such an enormous work project area that we can't do it by ourselves. We're a small nonprofit. We've got 2 employees. That's John Casani, who is your waterkeeper, the Calusa waterkeeper. You probably know him. He's on television about once a week. Every newscaster in the area, whether it's Wink or Fox or all the others, they have John's number on speed dial, because whenever there's a water quality problem, they call John. John is probably the most informed advocate and research scientist in the area on the state of our water. And we're privileged to have John as our waterkeeper. So he is fighting hard to try to correct these problems. And I'm the other employee. I'm the executive director of Calusa Waterkeeper. My name is Casey Schulberg. But we can't do this alone, so what we did was we started to train citizen scientists. So we put them through some training with John Casani on the science of the environment and how to test our water, how the biology of our environment works, and some advocacy so that they can show up at town halls, they can become our ambassadors, and they can help advocate on our behalf and amplify our efforts, so a tiny little organization becomes much stronger due to the great work of our rangers. We just graduated 25 more rangers on the 5th of November, and are we good with Jessica's PowerPoint? Good, Mike. So I am really thrilled to have one of our wonderful waterkeeper rangers, who is a co-resident of yours here in Cape Coral. Her name is Jessica Blanks, and she went through the ranger training when did you graduate, Jessica? In March of this year. So Jessica went through the training and graduated from our Ranger Academy in March of this year. And Jessica lives here in Cape Coral. She's a great scientist. She's also the environmental compliance manager at Hertz. So that's her day job. So she is really qualified. And she's going to talk to you guys for a few minutes, and then I will come back and wrap things up and let you know how you can become involved. So thank you very much, Jessica, for joining us. Thanks for taking the time out and coming and sharing your thoughts today.
Thanks, guys. I challenged myself to be here today and put a presentation. It's basically a general summary of how the benefits of plant-based diet the benefits to the environment. So bear with my shyness. I know you've probably heard all these topics before: overpopulation, land degradation, pollution of air, water, soil and plants, water scarcity, there's deforestation, loss of wetlands, ocean acidification, and even with the livestock agriculture side of the industry, there's new diseases and genetic loss of in the livestock. And also with the fishing industry, there's the bycatch of turtles and marine mammals. I'm not going to go into all of these, but I'm going to talk about some of the main ones as far as water pollution and deforestation and some of the major effects of meat-based diet versus a plant-based diet. So, two questions that come to mind for me is where's the threshold of when are we no longer going to be able to compete with our food for land, water, and air, and with population increase. So the agriculture and livestock industry is also increasing. So where's that threshold? When is the buck going to stop? The other main question is, how efficient is it to feed livestock a similar food that we eat? We have a middleman eating our food. It's inefficient for energy production and the environmental impacts, among other things I have listed there. So how does livestock keep up with the demand to grow bigger and faster to feed more people? Farmers are challenged with coming up with more creative techniques for better production. There's already artificial insemination and biotechnology. They changed the diet to a more grain-based diet to enhance growth. So with that grain-based, there are higher yield crops. They're requiring more nutrients and more water to grow. And with that, there's 70% of the grains that are grown today of food crop are actually fed to livestock. So there's been a myth about, vegan or plant-based diets actually promote deforestation, but if 70% of the crops grown are fed to livestock, then that's a myth. And so with this increased livestock demand, how does that affect the carbon footprint? There's a few major, aside from existing livestock, we're talking about the increased demand for more livestock. There's cutting down trees and deforestation that actually reduces the carbon sink. I'm going to talk about carbon sink next, so don't worry if this isn't making a lot of sense. There's also the existing farms that raise our crops. They're going to be converting to crops for livestock. So by converting those existing farms, we're going to have to get quality food from farther away. There's even more transport, and that increases the carbon footprint as well. The third one is land degradation, loss of wetlands, and conservation land. So you're reducing a carbon sink there as well. And so all that means is we're increasing the carbon footprint by continuing with a meat-based diet. What does carbon sink mean? That's just, there's reservoirs that collect, I wouldn't say collect, they take in carbon from the air and they store it there. So we have grasslands, the forest, the oceans buffer CO2 from the atmosphere. There's artificial sequestration, so the technology for factories to sequester the carbon and greenhouse gases at the point source, and then they most likely they can dispose by deep well injection or other industries. One lesser discussed type of carbon sink is controlled burning. Actually, when you think about forest fires on the large scale, they actually impact the carbon cycle immensely. So there's technologies to control burning. That way you decrease that impact. You lessen the impact of the scale of forest fires. Okay. One thing about grasslands with cattle, that the land degradation, they actually impact the soil to retain the carbon. So if you have a healthy grassland and cover, that keeps the carbon in. So typically with cattle is the biggest impact. So if I say cattle more than pigs and chickens, it's because cattle has the greatest impact on the environment. I'll talk about the soil again. So for deforestation, what is deforestation? Well, this first sentence, it sums it up. 80% of forests that originally covered the earth are cleared, fragmented, or degraded. That means they're reducing the carbon sink. We're losing that ability to store carbon by reducing the forest footprint. Over the past 150 years, 30% of carbon CO2 buildup in the atmosphere is due to deforestation. For the Amazon rainforest alone, 91% of that destruction is due to animal agriculture. So with deforestation, we also have a loss of biodiversity and critical ecosystems. There's less protection from overflowing rivers. There's been several studies that have attributed deforestation to some of the large floods in China and Bangladesh. We reduce the ability for the forests to actually clean up the air and the water pollution. Ocean acidification. So I know this is a topic people have heard, maybe they don't quite understand, but basically the ocean takes in CO2 from the atmosphere, about 30%. And as it does that, as that CO2 increases in the atmosphere, so is it's increasing in the oceans, and it adjusts the pH and the alkalinity. So by doing that, it's increasing the hydrogen ions and decreasing the availability of carbonate ions. By doing that, it's basically acidifying. It's a very slow process. It's not like it's going from pH 7, 8 to 4 and everything's going to die. It's a very slow process. And that process affects calcifying organisms. So shells and coral reefs, they are actually losing some of the structural capacity to build and maintain their shells, and it leaves them susceptible to disease and early death. There's also an effect on non-calcifying organisms. They're less susceptible to detect predators. So fish have these little ear bones. They're called otoliths. They're calcium carbonate. It affects how they detect, how they sense movement and predators around them. So, what other air pollutants from animal agriculture are there? So, of 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions, those are attributed to agriculture for livestock. 37% of that is methane. 65% of the greenhouse gas emissions is agricultural. Animal agriculture attributes to 65% of the nitrous oxide emissions, and those two alone, methane is 20 times more potent as far as global warming potential than CO2, and nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than CO2 for global warming potential. These lead to smog, acid rain, wildlife sickness, ozone depletion, and forest damage. Ammonia is another constituent that actually gets released to the atmosphere from agriculture. 90% of ammonia is released from agriculture, and that's fertilizer and livestock. And you might say, okay, well, fertilizer, we need that to grow our own crops, but going back to that high yield crop that they're using for livestock, it's actually adding more fertilizer than you think than would be for food for ourselves. And just to review some of the water pollutants from animal agriculture, livestock manure it gets into our waterways through runoff. That goes to that land degradation I was talking about earlier, how if you don't have a good ground cover, you're actually reducing that capacity to hold constituents, and you get more pollutants in your runoff. There's pesticides, fertilizers, antibiotics, and an interesting fact is 2% of the world's energy is used in production of artificial nitrogen fertilizers for high energy crops. Fertilizer needed for feedstock is attributed to 60% of the nitrogen pollution. And I already talked about the land degradation. And additionally, the more pesticides, pollution, you create these dead zones, and there's 405 identified dead zones in the world. And that means nothing is ever going to grow there. The good thing is they are reversible, so we keep cleaning up. They can strive again. A little bit more about nitrous oxide, just because it is so much more potent. 65% of nitrous oxide emissions comes from meat, egg, and dairy industries. And there is a naturally occurring, plants actually emit nitrous oxide, and so 5 to 10% of the atmosphere nitrous oxide is from plants alone, but it's increased by 16% since 1750. nitrous oxide can persist for 150 years in the atmosphere, and it's up there a very long time, and it comes out as, it gets deposited, and it can lead to nitrification, algal blooms, and eutrophication, so that goes into creates more dead zones. With the wastewater treatment process, there's actually a release of nitrous oxide. You don't think about this, but with the breakdown process of degrading proteins, ammonia is produced, and then ammonia is then degraded, and you have nitrous oxide as well. So since we're talking about wastewater, let's talk about poop. I thought that was funny. Okay, so methane from agriculture contributes to 7% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So 20% of methane is also from just the gut, the fermentation in the gut, and 3 to 7% of methane from manure management is attributed to the total greenhouse gas emissions. The wastewater treatment process produces a small portion of greenhouse gas emissions. That's 7% of global gas emissions, and that's everything. That's all wastewater treatment. But if you think about meat-based diets, the proteins are actually harder to break down. It's a more costly process. So, and with that, you have more ammonia. Ammonia actually inhibits the process, so they have to spend more money on the treatment process to not have it break down, and then again you have nitrous oxide from the ammonia, and there's more methane and more ammonia from the wastewater treatment process. If you have septic systems, I don't know how common they are around here. There's still a few septic systems in Cape Coral. They're building a new sewage line, so hopefully that helps everyone. But septic systems aren't necessarily bad, but first of all, if you have a septic system and you have a garbage disposal, you should probably get rid of the garbage disposal, because people tend to put anything down their garbage disposal. Fats, oils, and grease from meats, when it goes into your tank, there's actually this lipid layer that builds up on the surface of the liquid in your septic tank. And there's an outflow that goes to your drain field. The drain field is what disperses the poop, and it helps give a bigger surface area to clean up the nutrients in the poop. So with that outflow to the drain field, when you have a high lipid layer, because the more fats and the more, you throw that spaghetti grease down the drain, that actually builds up and it gets into the outflow line. And so you actually overflow that into your septic system. And it's too costly for the bacteria to break down. And so, again, you could have a damaged system. You're also, the degradation of that promotes ammonia and more nitrogen. So it's a very costly process. And older tanks in general don't have a fat skimming little filter. The newer tanks do. So it's just something to think about if you have an older tank. Also, if you lease your property, if you rent a house out to someone, you don't know what they're doing. So it's a good idea to get those systems checked every year. Okay. So what is this greenhouse gas emission? I looked at this paper, and one study suggested that 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions is equated from the food system, and 80% of that is from animal agriculture. So if we take another study where they said with a vegan-based diet you have a 70% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, you'd be looking at taking that carbon dioxide emission to the year 2030, you'd reduce it by 5 billion tons. Methane you would reduce by 2.4 billion tons, and nitrous oxide by 0.6 billion tons. So the math and the science shows that a plant-based diet is beneficial for the environment, for greenhouse gas emissions, and the other ones I talked about. So you want to look at what's in the food itself. This is a summary of, there's a calculator on a BBC website, and you can calculate how much of your food goes into greenhouse gas emissions. So I just summarized for beef, fish, cheese, rice, chicken, eggs, tomatoes, beans, and pasta. And it gives you the amount of emissions per year. So beef has over 1,600 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per year, and that equates to powering a car for over 4,000 miles, which equates to 164 gallons of gasoline. And it also uses 50,000 gallons of water. So if you compare that to beans and pasta, you're looking at about 20 kilograms of emissions per year for greenhouse gases, and you're only going to get that car to go about 56 miles and only use 2 gallons of gasoline to burn that car. So, and the water is 50 times less. So it's the data show, the math is awesome. And I'm not a full vegetarian, I apologize, but I am trying to be, and I really want to reduce my impact on the environment by knowing these numbers. What's interesting is rice. So even if you do have a plant-based diet, you can still be more responsible about what you eat. So rice is actually more costly on water consumption than chicken and eggs. So it's just little things like that to think about. These next few slides are just a breakdown of the food types. So we have the milks here, and then proteins, the range of proteins from beef down to nuts and peas. And the numbers don't really mean a lot. It's just a scale to show you how much beef is impacting per serving. That's per serving. And then for milks, you have dairy, and then so your almond, oat, soy, and rice milk are lower, and you see the rice milk's a little bit higher there. And here we have fruits and veggies, and then starches. So it looks like, wow, avocados are very high here, but that scale is to 0.2. That's less than what the rice milk and not rice milk, but almond milk and all that. And your starches, you see there that rice is higher, so you'd be better off doing potatoes and bread and oatmeal. Okay, so one thing to think about, I talked about earlier, is when is that threshold going to come where we don't want to compete with our food source anymore for land and water and air. But with that, there's going to be new technology. It's going to the livestock industry will try to drive that threshold further out. So there's going to be new technologies, innovations. We got to give them that. They may come up with new techniques to prevent pollution. And with that, if anybody's interested in where their career path is going to go in education, there's a lot of crazy careers here, like for kids to look into. So what the best way is harnessing the power of plants. There's a typo. They filter water, they filter air, they clean contaminants from soil. They're more efficient. They're a more efficient food source for human consumption than meat. They reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Their benefits are for health and financial benefits. There's so many studies on those, and just again with the land degradation for roots and ground cover, they help the soil retain more carbon and reduce runoff as well, and there's reduced wastewater treatment costs. So how do we improve our impact on our environment through diet? So eat more veggies, eat less meat, you've heard all this before, grow veggies vertical. I don't think we're going to be growing cows vertically, so you gotta think of new ways. Be better farmers, better scientists, eat only what you need to, and look into drought-tolerant species references. And I don't know if anybody has any questions, but it's a very general overview. With that, do we have any time for him to say?
Yeah, we got time for questions. I have a question.
Okay.
Because I went to Naples last week to the beach, and within about 2 blocks of going to the beach, I was coughing, and I walked on the beach, my eyes were stinging, and I got back, and then I literally passed out that night. I was talking on the phone with my wife, and I said, I gotta go to sleep now, and hung the phone up, and I just passed out. I mean,
red tide.
What do you think about the vegan lifestyle and its relation to that? And when I say vegan, I not only mean no animal products, because in the nonprofit we also talk about organic lifestyle and no chemicals, no man-made fertilizers, those types of things.
Yeah, the smarter agricultural practices could prevent make less pollution, and then, I mean, the red tide occurs naturally, but the growth of it is driven by pollution from runoff, and so it's astounding. It adds up. So every little thing that's smarter, like rice versus pasta, or looking at the technologies of an individual farmer, who's the better farmer, and looking at those factors. I think that.
Yeah, anybody else have any more questions? I can go around with the microphone.
Yeah, so red tide is pretty nasty stuff, and we've had a pretty strong red tide incident the last 6 weeks. It's historically occurring, so it's a natural phenomenon, but typically and traditionally and historically, it was in maybe 50 square miles further out in the Gulf. And what we're finding in recent years is that they've expanded into much larger. We had a 500 square mile outbreak last year. Typically, red tide season is October, so it's natural to have it starting to come at this time of year. It is not natural to have it lasting as long as these recent episodes, and it's not natural for it to be hugging the shoreline as it has. So we're quite convinced that it's being driven and exacerbated by runoff, as Jessica says, and by the nutrients we're putting into the water. Even the blue-green algae that comes down the Caloosahatchee, when it hits the salt water, hits a certain degree of salt water, the blue-green algae dies and it releases those nutrients that are then gobbled up by the red tide, so then it promotes another recycling of red tide. So this is nasty stuff. I wanted to thank Jessica, who said she's a little bit out of her comfort zone, but she did a great job, and it is testimony to the quality of our rangers. She did this on a moment's notice, putting this PowerPoint together. So we really want to thank Jessica for that. Thank you. So the red tide and blue-green algae are issues that we're going to have for a while, because we have not solved the underlying problems, which is that we're putting too many nutrients into our waterways. And these nutrients are coming primarily, probably the number one contributor is agriculture. North of Lake Okeechobee, we have the Kissimmee River starting at Orlando, flowing all the way down into Lake Okeechobee. There's a lot of agriculture, there's a lot of ranching, and they're contributing enormous amounts of nutrients into the Kissimmee that flow then into Lake Okeechobee, and then we get it left and right over the St. Lucie, and we get it on this side. We have issues in our own watershed. On this side, between Lake Okeechobee and Fort Myers, we've got an enormous watershed that contributes nutrients as well. So about 30 to 40% of our problem comes from Lake Okeechobee, and the rest is our own devising, our own contributions locally. So there are things we can do to alleviate the problem. We can eat more plant-based diets. We can go to a plant-based diet. My family has been vegan for about a year, between vegetarian and vegan. We kind of vacillate. We try to be vegan, and occasionally we drop back to vegetarianism. But we're convinced that this is part of the solution. I'm personally convinced that within 20 years, the entire world is going to be vegan. I think it's where we have to go to alleviate a lot of the problems that we have. We're stressing our environment. We're stressing all of these systems. We're stressing our sewage treatment plants. We're stressing our stormwater runoff. We're stressing our canals. We're basically stressing the global environmental system, and we need to ease off that. We need to back off that. We need your help. We need everybody's help. We need help from the federal government. I'm not going to make a political speech now. We're not getting the help we need from the federal government. We're getting a little bit of help on the state level, better than in the last administration. Again, I'm not being political. This is just facts. We're getting a little more help on the state level, but we have a lot more work to do. The FDEP is not doing their job in Florida. The Florida Department of Health is not doing their job. They're understaffed. I will give them credit for that. They're operating at about 30 to 40% of their staff capacity, so they're understaffed and they're under budgeted. We have to give them help. We have to hold them accountable. The Florida Department of Health is not doing its job. It's up to us. We've been picking up the slack and notifying the public about health risks. It's not our job. That is the job of the Florida Department of Health. So we think that all of these issues are interrelated. We should go more toward native Florida plants. We should be putting less grass and using more Florida native plants. They're wonderful plants. They're beautiful. They're just as lovely, and they require no water, no irrigation, and no fertilization. So this is another critical issue for us all to do. So basically, you can all get involved. I mean, the fact that you're here at a vegan food and information festival is testimony to your interest in this issue. You can educate yourselves. Our website is calusawaterkeeper.org. So go if you have a moment, go on our site or follow us on Facebook. We're a grassroots advocacy nonprofit organization based here in Southwest Florida. We are your water keepers. We're here to try to clean up your water, to try to serve your interest, and to improve your public health. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you, and thank you for your interest, and we will see you again.
All right, great presentation. Thank you very much, Jessica and Casey. And we've got a few more things to do, our items to let you know about. And Zaizo, are you here?
I am.
Yeah. Well, we have a few more minutes to get up, but you're welcome to go up a little bit early if you want. But let me get everything ready for you. And remember, we did make the announcement that if you want